Well, first off, thank you all for being here. When the idea for the WE3 Summit came up, my first question was, how can we possibly need another conference in the industry? But hopefully the speakers that you've already seen really give you the answer that we came up with, which was we felt that there was a conversation that wasn't happening with a different audience than maybe normally gets assembled at utility or energy water events. And so, just the speakers that we've seen with Manoj and Admiral Olson and others, you see really a diversity of opinion of how different people from different groups need to come together to really address these most important issues. So we thank you for coming and for your interest in this most important topic. Just to kind of set it up with a quote, I really liked this quote. What I liked about it the most, this is kind of a singing to the choir, preaching to the choir kind of a comment, but the thing I really liked about it the most, and it's really at the heart of what SEW thinks about on a daily basis, is this two words towards the bottom here, good decisions. Well, hard to disagree with good decisions, right? We should make good decisions. But what are good decisions? How can we make decisions that balance the needs of all the stakeholders? We don't think that you can reasonably address the climate concerns, water energy needs without thinking about the economic impacts and what the costs are. But good decisions at their core really require something that's important, and you've heard, I think, all of the speakers talk about it. I can't decide whether I was really excited or absolutely horrified by Admiral Olson's presentation and seeing some of the things. But what's great about it is it gets us information. And so, the conversation that we felt wasn't happening, at least to the extent it needed to, was this idea on the energy-water nexus. And so just a couple of fun facts to maybe kind of re-level set us as we go into the conversations for the rest of the day. Water is critical to energy. I was shocked, 19%, 1/5 of all of the electricity that we create here in California goes just to water. And somebody made the comment about wealth and wealthy countries and wealthy areas versus poorer areas. And maybe in some ways this is a vestige of the wealth that has existed in California. We have the money to do this, to move money from water from place to place at great expense, which has been critical to the economic development of California, but it comes at a cost. We'll have to check our number. We say 2.5 billion people with water scarcity. I heard 2.1 before. 2 billion people is a lot of people that live in areas of high water scarcity. And what's important when you look at the second slide that's coming are the areas with high water scarcity are almost always geographically in the areas with high energy scarcity. So they're not separate things. And so what's exciting about some of the innovations that Manoj shared is they've been thoughtful about how do we address those things together. California people, I know that Commissioner Sandoval would know for sure, but California still uses a lot of big hydro. Big hydro does not count against our carbon neutral energy production goals here in California when you look at the resource planning goals. Hydro is not included in that, but we've relied on hydro as a big source of relatively low cost and low carbon electricity in California. So as we have droughts and other issues, that has an impact negatively on our energy side. And then at a very practical level, and we have folks from the municipality, from a number of municipalities here, and we have a lot of clients who are municipals. Water and wastewater utilities, their typically largest single line item expense is energy, because it takes a lot of energy to perform those tasks. So if we look at the other side of the coin, globally, 15% of all water is used to support electricity production. And in the United States, we're actually worse than the global basis. There is a little bit of good news on this slide. which is taking a look at the different sources of electricity generation and how much water they take, or you might think of as the water intensity guide to energy production. Fossil fuels and natural gas are pretty bad. People think nuclear's bad. It's not as bad, actually, as some of the traditional fossil sources of generation are. But as we move towards solar and wind, those are less water intense than fossil generation is. So that's a good story, not all bad news, right? There's a good story that comes as we move our sources of generation to some of the more innovative and increasingly low-cost alternatives. We'll get a bit of a water win, and that's good. And those are the kinds of holistic views that we have to take. So the problem, as you've seen from the earlier speakers, and hopefully a little bit of what I've shared is pretty clear. You think there's a major call to action. The problem seems severe enough that you'd say, of course we're doing something about this. But I'm going to argue for my comments today that something's missing. So what's missing? And I'll frame it up this, and I actually put these slides together before I knew this was the case. I don't know if anybody knows Greta Thunberg. That's an actual person, that's just not a stock photo of a kid. And you can kind of see in the back, depending on how good your foreign language skills are, it's on strike for climate. And today is actually a day where students from pre-K through high school around the world are walking out of school and they're protesting. It's literally today, 15 March, 2019. What are they doing? Well, the quick story behind Greta is she lives in Brussels, Belgium, and back in August, she was in a conversation at school talking about climate, the impact of water and electricity, and the future of climate, and was unsatisfied with the conversation in school, so she walked out. And she walked out of school, and she walked onto Parliament, and sat on the steps of Parliament with a handmade sign, and said, "Hey adults, what are you doing about it?" And every single Friday, since then, she's protested out of school. This has become a thing. There are expected to be somewhere between 3 and 4 million kids who skip school today to protest for climate. And if you haven't had a chance to see her TED Talk, it's pretty cool. She got pulled in to do a TED Talk. For a 15-year-old kid, pretty impressive. I really liked her quote, though. This is from the Financial Times. I did not give them attribution, so I'll get in trouble with the FT. But this is a difference in generations, right? I'm a kind of a borderline, baby boomer going into Gen X, right? So I'm about action and doing stuff, and this conference is about action. But I really liked her quote. I don't want your hope. I want you to panic. By most estimations, we've only got about 7 years left to turn the tides on climate to have a meaningful impact. Otherwise, the flywheel gets out of control. So think about Greta, think about 3 million kids as we go into this conversation. And I think Greta's call to action really hits the points that I want to make quickly before we move on to the next step, which is there's a process here that we feel we need to follow, and it's really going to start with people. Because if we don't get people engaged in this, and the theme of the conference here for engagement and education and then empowerment is really key. There's a ton of great stuff that's happening. We're here in Silicon Valley. There's people doing all sorts of interesting things in the back office, software providers, solution providers, people making hardware, some of the things you've seen already today. That a lot of those they're awesome, but they happen kind of behind the scenes. They're behind the curtain, right? And so we all get to selfishly wake up, throw the light switch, turn on the faucet, And as you've heard some of the earlier speakers talk to, there's not a lot of pain involved. So we're not kind of forced to engage in what the issues are. If we had to carry the water those hundreds of yards to wash the dishes or do the laundry or take the shower, we'd probably think pretty differently about how much of that we use, but we're not forced to do that. And I'm not suggesting that we want to make people carry their water to take a shower, but I do think that we want to make sure that we get people engaged in this and get them to think about and understand the issues. So this engage, educate, and empower piece, and I thought about it after the fact, and our graphic's probably a little bit wrong here, because we probably should have made it a circle. Because we've done a ton of research, and SEW has helped to sponsor some of it, groups like the Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative and others. And what we know from people, when we talk to them, we do surveys, we do focus groups, is that when you get people into the game, when they become engaged, then they want to learn more. And the more they learn, and the more they understand, the next thing that happens is they want to act. What's the so what? And once I act, that builds that engagement, and the process kind of starts again. So our goal with the WE3 Summit is to start this conversation off as Jason said at the beginning, it's an inaugural event. It will take on a life of its own and become its own thing. But if we really focus on these three things, and I want to make sure, and when we finish this section, we'll get to the empowerment part, that it's not just talking about problem. We start to shift into that, and so, what do we do about it? So what's the first step? We've got to get people to engage, right? Sitting on the sidelines doesn't do any of us any good. It doesn't help people, it doesn't help society, and it doesn't get the motion moving forward. Some of the issues and challenges that have been brought up during the earlier conversations and the need for governments and policy to get moving here. The important thing that I would say is that, especially from a governments and policy perspective, these are either elected positions or they're people who are appointed by elected officials, and they react to voters. And so if we don't get people engaged in wanting to address the issues, then there's not anything likely to change in the process. And these are complicated processes. It's great to have some commissioners here. It's great to have utility people here. I'm not of the belief that magic answers are going to fall from the sky. We have a very complex system that's got 100+ years of regulation and unintended consequences built in. So the first step of this is to get people engaged in the process. And the evidence that we have in talking to people is pretty solid. If you take people who say that they will engage in this because of environmental concerns or because of money and the desire to save money, that's about 65% of people, right? So we do have some outliers. There's about 20% of the people who literally will say, I literally don't care and I don't want to hear anything about it. So we'll have to get to them later. But we've got about 80% of people in total who will tell us that they're ready to engage. But when we engage them today, we've done a couple of things wrong, I think, historically, that we have to address. The first is a lot of it, and we've seen some of it here, we'll talk more about it today. When we talk about the problems on the global basis, they become unreal. That's a problem that happens to someone else, somewhere else, and what does it mean to me? And the second thing we've done is the ways that we've communicated with people are, I'll call it old-fashioned. And I don't mean that in the cool kind of quaint old-fashioned. I mean outdated. I talk to utilities, regulators, and people all over the world, and they'll say, well, I have all of that information. It's on my website. You just have to go to the 43rd tab, 17 layers down, and all of the information is there for you. Well, that's not the way we communicate with people anymore. So one of the things that we've tried to address at SEW with the products that we build and the way we engage people is we have to go to people and communicate with them on the means and on the basis that they want to be communicated with. How do they get information today? Most of you get push alerts and little notifications. Your messaging and your knowledge comes in lots of really small chunks all of the time. So if we want to address these people, if we want to provide people information and get them into the game, we got to communicate with them on that basis. And then the last thing is we have to empower people. So we have, at SEW now, kind of circa 200 million people on our platform. So people who, the utilities and the other agencies that we serve have about 200 million people on their platform. And this progression that I'm talking about has become very clear. In the beginning, people say, I just didn't know. I don't know. But once they know and once they learn more, once they're given innovative offers, then they say, I want to act, right? And so one of the things, and we'll talk about it throughout the day, is we have to think about how the regulatory context works, how the offers that service providers put out there to give people really innovative and exciting ways to act. Harman earlier mentioned the default time of use rates that have come in California, and I agree, most people don't know about them. So once they know about them, what are they going to want to do? They say, what do I do about it? How do I engage? And this is where I think technology is really going to come into play. Because one thing I wouldn't want anyone to believe is that what we're asking people to do is dedicate an hour of their day to thinking about these problems. I don't think that's going to happen, right? I think they're going to think about it for moments and seconds, and then technology is going to come in and allow them to make some choices, and then it's all automatically going to happen. And technology will do that. And we will create better and more interesting technologies once those markets are available. And those markets will become available when the offers that are put forth by utilities are more interesting and engaging to come. So I'll take a look at things like smart speakers in homes, right? So did anybody 2 years ago sit around and say, what I really want is a cylinder that sits in the middle of my kitchen table that talks at me? Probably not. And yet you see the massive uptake of smart speakers coming now, because once we create the technologies and create the engaging reason for people to participate, adoption happens. So we're going to keep going on this for the rest of the day. From our perspective at SEW, as we said at the beginning, our goal here is to make this an actionable event, both thought-provoking and interesting for us to all gain new ideas. But that at the end of it, it isn't that we all hop in our cars and go home and say, boy, that was an interesting use of my day. We want to turn this into action. And so with that, I'm going to bring Chris up, because as some of you may have seen, we had this notion of how do we make this an actionable event, and how do we get people to make a pledge? And that pledge could be a couple of different things. So just to kind of kick it off, some of the examples that we've done at SEW, we're as I said, serving about 200 million customers. Our drive, our passion is to get it to about 1 billion people as soon as we can. We're in 14 countries now, and we have a very ambitious plan to grow globally. But as we've done that, every time we go to a new place, we make donations of water filtration systems to help and empower people that don't have access to clean water. And the other small thing that we're going to try to do that's an actionable thing for us is the downside of this global travel thing is we got to travel a lot, which is kind of a little bit inherently inconsistent with sustainability. So we're pledging to do 100% carbon offset for all of the travel of all of our people to get this to go. Because as our growth expands, we don't want to be our own worst enemy. So think of this as how do we create sustainable sustainability, right? How do we make sure that the systems that we're putting in place, the technologies and the initiatives are not only good, but can self-grow and self-fund. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate those comments.